try our best to set up a space here where we acknowledge past, present harms and future possibilities in this conference. And it makes me deeply honored to introduce my friend and colleague, Jennifer Llewellyn, as part of this conference theme. Thank you for that. I usually beat these things terribly when I'm doing this. Jennifer's been described to me by Stephanie and a lot of other people as a person who can step into a conversation and lift it up almost immediately. So what we're asking you to do here today is lift us up and give us a good start. You can read Jennifer's biography in the conference handout. She is director of the Restorative International Learning Community, which 4 years ago, a group of people in this room said yes. We'd like to have the next rotation of that meeting here, again in Vermont. And Bobby backstopped it and said, VLS, we'll do it. If you can't find any place else, I'll do it. And we all said, thanks, Bobby. We'll know you're going to end up doing this, and we really appreciate you for doing this, Bobby. So this was the occasion to have the International Learning Community back here to do it, but it was also the occasion of bringing together people who were interested in these other themes about environment, interpersonal violence, to come together and try to find some ways to see what should the person who's interested in climate change have to talk with about people who try to find safety for victims of interpersonal violence, who are interested in the rights of children being taken away and put into foster care. Jennifer Llewellyn's entire history is associated with the words relational theory, restorative justice. She's known internationally all over the place. And I guess I'd stop here by saying that the words that most resonate is that she's so full of energy. She's got so much commitment, as exemplified by, she facilitated a meeting in Canada yesterday, flew to Montreal and drove here all night and got up to come here. That's my experience of her, is that she works around the clock. Her leadership internationally, and most of all, her generosity, especially in including to us here in Vermont over the years, is so welcome. And I thank you so much, Jennifer, for coming and doing this.
Well, good morning. That's quite a challenge to describe me as energetic after the morning I've had. so I'll work on that. And it's quite an act to follow. I must say, I'm not sure I could be more uplifting than having the opportunity to come into the words of an Attorney General talking like that in a continent that needs that so badly right now. So I found that profoundly uplifting this morning, because those are the words that need to be spoken, and we all need to be speaking regularly. And so as your neighbors to the north, we spend a lot of time paying attention to what's happening in the United States these days, and seeking ways to stand in solidarity with those of you who will make the change and the difference in terms of that reality. I also stand here very grateful to be on the presence of the territory of the Abenaki people. It's a great honor to be able to meet here and to be able to meet on land and in a place that was cared for before we came. And before we came to this place. I have had the same honor in Canada and have spent a lot of time living on land that's been cared for and learning into knowledge that comes from both the Mi'kmaq people and the land that I live in, Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada, but also from survivors of residential schools, which were institutions in our country that took children from their parents and separated them for generation after generation, seeking to make them other than who they were. And they knew that to do that, they had to take them from their land, from their community, and from their parents. But out of that came an intense knowledge that was never lost of the importance of relationships, of the importance of being in caring relationships, and of the importance of all our relations. And so it's that knowledge that's, I think, been very important to me in terms of how I approach my work, what my work is. But I also think it's that knowledge about connection and about caretaking and about the importance of right relations with one another and the earth that we're seeking to spend time together, extending and advancing and dwelling within in the next several days. So our most pressing challenges, some of which were described here this morning, others of which surround us every day in newspapers and news reports and in stories from neighbors, are actually challenges that are clearly rooted in interconnection. They show us every single day how interconnected we are. They are problems that then are complex and hard to unravel and hard to address and hard to know where to start or how not to intervene in a way that will make some other problem or some other part of that problem more challenging. And that's because that we intervene in a way that ignores that interconnection often. So this conference and its focus on issues of interpersonal relationships, community and the importance of leadership in community and the importance of restorative communities or community building, and on the environment, identifies some of these areas where very clearly our dilemmas are relational, are about our relationships with one another. But what connects them isn't simply that they are all relational challenges or that we might respond to them that way. They are interconnected one with the other, and of course with us in the center, right? People in the center of our experience with those, not because we are the most important in those issues, but because they are clearly impacting who we are, what we are, how we can be. And so I want to think a little bit about why would we focus on these three sort of major areas, these interpersonal harms, community, and the environment. What connects them? Because surely more must connect them than just we think they're ripe for a restorative approach. You know, they're ripe for restorative practices. I think, in fact, they are layered and intersecting. Right? They are nested in one another. We can't separate one from the other. It makes sense to put them in this conference, in this place, where we would be thinking about how they matter for us and in terms of how they intersect. That's particularly clear in our theme about interpersonal relationships, right? It is certainly true that interpersonal relationships are central to who we are important to us, make a difference for us. They can be positive. They can also be profoundly harmful. In fact, they can be so profoundly harmful because they go to the core and can get to the core of who we are and who we can be. That's true of our criminal justice, the harms that our criminal justice system deals with. It's also particularly true of interpersonal violence in ways that impact women, in ways that impact children, in ways that impact families. And we've spent a lot of time trying to respond to interpersonal violence, to try to take it out of the shadows, to try to make it a public justice issue, to ensure that it's not a private matter. And we've done that in many countries, in many systems, particularly those inspired by sort of Western legal traditions, by requiring pro-prosecution, right? By saying this matters, by ensuring that there is public attention and that we deal with this as a public problem. And that was important. We needed to take it out of behind closed doors and ensure that we could bring resources to bear to address interpersonal violence, to provide supports. The problem is the system we brought it into the public, but into a system that is deeply oriented to focusing on individuals, that saw the problem nonetheless as a problem about individual bad actors, about individual harms, about individual victims. And what we didn't successfully do was move it in a relational way, was look at it as a public problem, not just because it's of public interest or ought to be of public interest, because it is actually a problem born out of and connected to the way we structure relationships, the way we live with one another, the norms we create, the ways in which we recognize the ripple impacts and effects, and the ways in which we recognize that those ripple impacts and effects from that act ripple and impact people who will commit those acts in the future. It is not possible to address interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence. It's not possible to address family violence if we can't do more than just bring it to light and bring it into the public, if we can't see ourselves in that mirror, if we can't understand our responsibility. It's not a personal problem. It's also not an individual problem. It has everything to do with the other theme that we're interested in, which is thinking about community, how we live, how we treat one another, how we structure the ways in which we interact with one another, how we live together. It has everything to do with how our institutions are built, how our organizations work, how we encounter one another at work, how we educate children, right? How we pray together, how we respond to religion and church. It has everything to do with the standards we set for how we do that, for our human rights, for how we think about protecting the dignity and advancing our understanding of one another. Right? So we need to think about, as the sub-theme of this conference does, and I want to talk a bit more about that, our communities, because our interpersonal relationships are nested in those communities. And then, of course, our communities are nurtured and impacted and affected and structured and determined in many ways by our environment. So that's certainly true in terms of the impact of climate change that's sparking natural disasters and significant changes in our world that are forcing people to move from where they have lived, to find new place, to try to enter into new relationships, to be part of new communities, our immigration and migration issues. It's certainly true in terms of our use of natural resources or our misuse of natural resources and how we share those resources we're going to need to live with one another. It's also true about the choices we make in terms of the ways we live impacting and structuring the environment and the world. So it's a two-way relationship that we have as we think about our environment. And yet, much of our approach to regulation there too thinks about it in isolated interventions, individual problems, contractual agreements. We don't move ourselves to think about how we need to regulate an area in a way that's mindful that we're in relationship with the earth, that it is an interconnected ecosystem of relationships that affects us all the way up and all the way down, from our individual interpersonal relationships to the communities in which we live, to the land on which we stand. So then what do we do? How do we stop seeing the world in these individuated boxes as isolated issues? Or how do we stop responding to the world that way even when we know it's not like that? So the sub-theme of the conference talks about a restorative approach to community building, to building communities. And I think that's important. And so I want to talk a bit about what is it about a restorative approach that's going to help us build communities and hopefully build better communities, be in better communion with one another and together on this earth. And what's the difference between seeing that as a tool or a mechanism or a way or an approach that's going to help us build connection, and then what does that say to us about once we're connected, the way in which we live together in community, for the character of our community? Because I think those are slightly different things, and certainly the theme of this conference incorporates both. So a restorative approach, if there's any kind of definition, and we don't do so well with definitions, partly because we spend a lot of time trying to describe to people how the furniture will be organized or how people will feel, or telling them stories to try to make believable something our systems have made unbelievable, which is we could actually just believe in people. We could actually create opportunities for us to do right by one another. So we often see people describe restorative justice. One of the hallmarks is, right, it's victim, offender, and community. There's like a triangle. And we bring them together, and that's how we work. I think that's true. That is how we work. But all too often then we try to operationalize that. So like, who's the community? What are they doing? We often think about it from the practice or process side. You know, where are they going to sit? Who am I going to find? Who's going to sit in the community seat? What are they going to do? Is it going to be a panel? Are we going to put people in front of it? How can I find one more volunteer? Because we're all really exhausted right now, right? Who's the community? This is the right question. And we need to keep asking the question. And what's important is that we keep asking the question. We need to be really worried when we think we found the answer. We need to be really worried, I think, when we set up programs or practices and we figure out what seat the community sits in. That's the very time I think we should be most worried that probably we're not getting the point. For me, the mantra, our mantra as restorative justice and restorative folks, it's the victim, the offender, and the community, sometimes obscures for us that the community is pointing us to look for connection, that the community is reminding us to look beyond the individual, that the community part of that triad is requiring us to look for relationships, connections, interconnections. Where's the ripple effect of what's happening? Who's affected? Who's impacted? Who can help? If we want things to go right in the future, who can help? How are we thinking about how we bring people into community with one another in response to what's gone wrong? If we're thinking about how do we foster relationships that can go right more often, this requirement to think about the community is a requirement to think relationally, is a requirement to think not just about the two people in front of you, but how they're connected and who they're connected to and where they're connected to. And when we do that, then the answer to where does community show up in process? What's their role? What do they do? What do they say? Are they the facilitator? Are they the funders? Do they own the program? Do they not own the program? Is it all about just community versus the state? I think that melts away a bit, or at least it becomes hazier because it becomes more complicated. Because this requirement to think about, we can't do restorative justice if all we said is it's about the victim and the offender. We can't make the difference we're trying to make to the way we think about justice and to the way we think about approaching education or human services, in health, in child welfare, if we then are not asking about relations. How and what is this related to? How must we be making connections? And when we do that, we can see that one of the tasks before us is being intentional about building those relationships, about building those connections. process by process, practice by practice, but also in the main. So if the way in which we are implementing restorative work doesn't think about how is the way we're working building community in a broader way, how is it not just solving this problem and then this problem and then this isolated problem and then this isolated, without asking about how those isolated problems are connected to a whole, without being in a community, without building a system that when we identify how an isolated issue is connected to the whole, we can do something about it. So that doesn't mean you turn every single process with the poor people who are in the room into a massive process to address the wider social inequalities. But it does mean that we should be building restorative communities so that when we do that work one by one issue and harm and opportunity, and we see the ways in which when we ask about connection, when we ask about community, we understand what relations need to be changed, impacted, built, that we can do that work in a wider way because we are being restorative as a community. Because then the places we could look to help, the community we look for, will be much more present. It will be where people work, where people play, where people learn, where people pray. And I do think that that's slightly different than looking at a community only through the lens of how do they show up when we're doing restorative process? Or how are they relied on to foster restorative process in response to issues and incidents and harms, or proactively to build better institutions? Because if we started to then think, okay, so out of these experiences, the kind of community we want to foster in the room or around a young person or around an offender or around a mother and child who needs support, shouldn't we want to be building that for everyone? I think that's the moment that has people thinking, once we build community, how do we maintain it? How do we sustain it in a way that makes things go right more often? How do we think about being a restorative community? Or a city, or a state, or a province, or a country, or a world? Like, what would that mean? It has to be more than a bumper sticker. It has to be more than something you put on the sign. It has to be something more than that. We do a lot of that, right? We're going around in circles a lot. We have a lot of practitioners who do that, or we do it in this system and that system and this system, right? That's good. But it's not going to make the difference if it doesn't go to the core of how it is we think about who we are, what it means to be community, what it means to be in community, how those values, that way of thinking impacts how we govern, how we lead, how we structure organizations, how we plan our budgets, right? How we design our immigration laws. So I think to do that, we have to think about how we're going to do that. And before we can get to how we're going to do that, I think we do have to think about being able to articulate, maybe not the definition, but certainly the heart of the matter, the why we do this, what this is about, right? I love T.J. Donovan's It's About People. It is about people. And I think it's most profoundly about people when you recognize that people are relational. That's the kind of beings we are. That's how we tick. So you may know this, you may know Simon Sinek's work on the Golden Circle. I'm, by and large, I think the polite version of, Gail gave you the polite version. I'm a kind of a geeky theorist mostly, who tries to be useful to the world. as a geeky theorist can be. So I spend a lot of time trying to say, nothing so practical as a good theory. Thinking matters. That does turn out it matters. How you think about the world affects what you do, how you see things, how you react, what you think is possible. A more palatable version of that than starting your day with a geeky theorist is probably Simon Sinek, who may be slightly too commercialized for this theorist, but I don't think he's wrong. I think he's telling you what lots of social theorists believe, which is why we do things matters. So in his language, he'd say, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. For us, most people don't buy what we do at all. They don't even fund it well. So be that as it may, he has a point, which is people find it hard to believe in things that they don't understand the why of. And we're so anxious as restorative folks to make a difference in the world because there is so much that needs to be done that we almost always start from the outside in. And we find it so hard to have enough time to have conversations about why things really matter. I joke in Nova Scotia, our elevators are so short. We don't have a lot of tall buildings. I don't have long elevator pitches for the, it's about relational theory. Can we start from, so, what do you do when they ask you what restorative justice is? Well, we get victims, offenders, and community together, and we put them in a room, and they often sit in a circle, and sometimes there's Kleenex, and it's really good. They hug. There have been these moments of, that's what we do, right? Sometimes we get a little bit more, even more precise, because we're really trying to pitch it to people who could make a difference in institutions. And so then we show up and we have like fancy packages and binders and question cards, and we have ways like, look what you can do. It'll be easy. And wrong when it's easy. But we start with the what. This is, I think, helpful to us, right? Which is when we start with the what. And that's what we show up telling people. And that's what we end up teaching people in schools, in the justice system, I'll tell you what to do because I'd like you to do the right thing. So could you just do this and it'll work out? Sometimes it does. It makes it better sometimes. It's not often very sustainable. Because as soon as we walk away, they go back to doing what they've always done before, because when things got rough, they turned, you weren't still there, there was no update to the package, they don't have another what to pull off the shelf, and so what do? Well, they do what they've always done, because that's, they got to get things done. So we probably do need to be giving people more than what. And certainly, if we want people to be able to think differently in diverse and multi-layered and ever-changing challenges, the Twitter feed from your president alone gives you hour-by-hour evolving challenges to respond to. I can't look at it anymore. I really can't imagine how you can. I know Gail Burford can't anymore. I need to say, I feel that we're centering a support group around the daily pain, and I can only imagine that's multiplied. I think we need to start talking first about why we do this, because then we can actually say how we do this. How does this show up? And then there can be great diversity about what we do based on why and how. So let me say a little bit more about that in grounding our way forward in the conference. So why do we do this? I think we do this, now no surprise, given that I've told you I think everything is relational. My kids would tell you that too about me, but they roll their eyes and find it annoying. I'm hoping you find it less annoying given the subject matter of the conference. But I do think most things are actually relational. They've got that right. Maybe that's my elevator pitch. Fundamentally, we are relational. And that means a heck of a lot more than just we live in relationships. We do that. I was acutely aware of that last night, trying to get Air Canada to transport me on time. You should give lessons. You're early. We're 15 minutes early to this talk. They can't even get me to Montreal. So we do live in relationships. We've organized our society in a way in which we live together. But I think there's something much more fundamental than that. And I think we know there's something much more fundamental about that. It's not relationships are strategic. We can strategically deploy them to get people to do what we want. You know, once you know that people live in relationship, you look around and you find which ones are influential and you think about how to use them. Or they're good when we build them, right? Like, so we always talk about relationships as if they're a good. We'll build relationships, we'll make I think actually, if we're honest with ourselves, right? Relationships aren't something that we just have chosen to live in. We couldn't have lived otherwise. We're born into relationships. We're connected to the earth. It's not something we can escape, but it's also not something that's necessarily good if we're relational. If that's how we learn, how we become, how we change, how we are harmed. If that's true, relationships just are. They are a reality of who we are as part of this larger relational ecosystem. And if that's true, we need to be looking at things relationally all the time because things are relational all the time. And when we look at them that way, it'll be very clear that that doesn't mean they're good all the time, right? Our most profound challenges are relational challenges. Oppression is a relationship. Dominance, inequality, neglect, harm. These are not going to be fixed by relationships. They are relationships. We need to be then thinking about if that's the case, we must be seeking to foster the sorts of relationships and interconnections that allow us to be well, that allow the earth to be sustained, that allow us to support and care for one another. So it isn't a matter of relationships are great. It's we actually have to be constantly engaged in relational analysis. And when we do that and realize that all of our work is relational, we have to be constantly asking if our institutions and our structures and our laws and our policies are up to the task of doing that relational work. Do they pay attention to relationships? Are they analyzing and seeing the situation as one of interconnection and relationship? Are they pretending that we're these atomistic, isolated individuals? Are they our criminal justice system that thinks we can find the problem and lock it up? Are they our campus sexual violence policies that think we can expel misogyny? Are they our immigration laws that think if we just put up a wall, all our problems will be fine because we'll keep those individuals on that side and us on this side? And so we're relational, so are all of the communities, regions, states, cities that we live in. And we know that. Like you actually did not need a law prof from Canada to come and tell you that. You know that. We know that. We don't know how to make it matter. We don't make it matter every day. We don't make it the nature of the enterprise. So what does a restorative approach have to say about this? Why does it matter? How, if that's why we do things, because we are relational, and that should matter, how do we do that? Well, I think we change the way we see things. It helps us understand what matters differently. It needs to impact how we lead, how we govern, how we make decisions, how we make choices. It's not just a program to be funded by City Council, it's how City Council should roll. It should guide our policies, our practices, our processes, both when we're responding when things go wrong, but also when we are seeking through our institutions and our structures and our programs and our human services to make things go right. That's not going to happen just through a bunch of practices, by doing a bunch of things differently. It's got to be, they have to emerge out of a culture, a change. They have to be part of those practices, those processes, those strategies, those programs we fund. They have to be part of a restorative approach, not a bunch of restorative approaches, just another way of using a word that means practices or processes. Or that has to be our approach, our way of seeing, our way of doing, our way of understanding, right? Who we are, how we do things, how we look at things. We take a restorative approach that then has to show up in what we do, in all we do. So how does it show up there? So this says, think back. Did you add anything differently? That's me cooking all the time. All the time. And I was in Newcastle, Australia. I don't think it was very long ago. I think it was a couple weeks ago. And I was confessed, I found myself talking about my grandmother, right? Because all our relations matter, and for whatever reason, she mattered to me that morning. Because I was thinking about how do you build a restorative community. And the best example for me of who built community in my life was my grandmother. She may have had no choice. She was one of 20 children, and she was the middle child, and she was the caretaking child, and she lived in a small community in Nova Scotia in Pictou County. They're good-hearted people there, and they had no money, and yet they built a very happy and thriving community. My grandmother did this with one particular skill and talent. Well, she was lovely and loving and would listen to everybody's problems, but she cooked a lot. And so it's actually with some shame, I confess regularly that I can't cook. But she taught me something in that moment of watching her nurture people, of watching her build community, of watching her be able to cook for every church supper and every crisis. And when something went wrong, I still find myself on people's doorsteps when something goes wrong with nothing to do but food. Not made by me because I'm trying to help. It's always better if you bring something good. But she taught me what it means to be able to make community, to build relationships, to nurture people. And the skills she had to do that didn't come from a recipe book. The skills that she had to do that, remember, no money, small community, relatively isolated. She could make something out of nothing. She knew what was in season, what came out of their garden. They took stuff from their garden and put it in a root cellar so you could have it all winter. They would fish all summer and put it in the freezer so that they would have food to make stuff out of. She understood what she could then do with the stuff that was in the freezer and the stuff that was in the root cellar, or what was in the fridge when people dropped by in multiple numbers and needed to be fed. And she would always make it look rather effortless. She didn't have the panicked moment that I have with my spouse when people show up. What's in the house? Is there anything I can put in the oven quickly? Who can we call? She didn't do that. And part of the reason she didn't do that was she understood the principles for good cooking. And I can't do that. I can't nurture that way. But she did give me something in those moments, which was she showed me that answers for how to build community don't come from a box, and they don't come from a book, and they're not as easy as having the recipe. What you need are a good, strong set of principles for how to make good stuff. And I think that's the how on Simon Sinek's thing. And I am not a very good cook. I'm pretty good at cooking up restorative processes. And I can adapt to the crisis that walks in the door, whether it's residential schools or responding to abuses in our home for colored children, or thinking about deaths in custody, or thinking about addressing failing schools, or looking at building better care for young people in our communities. And the way I can do that is not because I've got a bag of tricks and a recipe for every minute. the way I can do that is I think I understand the principles of a restorative approach. I think I understand the principles for working relationally, for making relationships matter, for working with what we have. And I think we need those principles. And I think that's, in fact, what we need to be sharing with one another, recognizing in one another's work, asking about when we don't see it in one another's work. And so these are some of those principles that guide me, right? That we work in ways that are relationally focused, that we're constantly being reminded that community thing, it ain't a chair in the circle. Right, that we're asking questions about interconnection, that we're looking for how both people and issues and incidences are connected. That requires us then to work in comprehensive, holistic, integrative ways. That we can't just say, just the facts, only this incident, we're only here to talk about this. Because if you don't think that's the issue at the circle, then you've not properly, and the people there think it's the issue or have brought it in, or it's waiting right outside the door, then it's the issue that you need to be addressing, right? Or you need to figure out how what you are addressing is going to relate to or impact those broader issues. We need to work in inclusive and participatory ways if we're going to work relationally. That's got to mean more than just a tick box of who's in the room, of who we consulted, of who got included. Inclusion has to be meaningful. It has to make a difference that people are in the room. They have to know they could make a difference, or there's no point in them being in the room except that you've checked the boxes and felt that you had an inclusive consultation process. And so to do that, we have to be very attentive to how we build processes that can be participatory. And that doesn't mean that no one ever has authority and no one ever can make a decision and we always have to do everything by consensus. It does mean we have to be really transparent and clear about what participation is possible, how it's going to make a difference, right? How those decisions are going to be made, and people have to see themselves back in the decisions that are made. That doesn't mean they have to agree with them, but they do have to understand them. And if people don't, and that's more than just come in a room and explain it to them, they must understand them because they can see that they've been understood in the making of those decisions. They can't be the windowless room. The other thing that broke my heart about the windowless room story was the description of being a law student, because I think we educate our law students like that too. We put them essentially in windowless rooms. And we strip. One of my law students says we murder people's stories because we break them up and we make them no longer their stories, and we analyze the pieces that matter to us, and we never see them, and we never understand how they got there, and we teach law school mostly through appellate level decisions where what matters is the law, and we're learning the law on the backs of people's lives that we don't know. And then we wonder why when we send them out in the world, they're really good at being in the windowless room. It's because we don't make that participatory either. They need to be responsive. If we're going to work restoratively, we got to be willing to be flexible. We've got to be adapting and responding to what's in the fridge and what's in season and what the temperature is outside, what people need, what we know, and alert to what we don't know. We have to be focused not only on individuals and their taking of responsibility, but on collective taking of responsibility. So the community is not just in the room to wag the finger and hold the moral majority, but to understand and comprehend their responsibility there. We want to work in collaborative and non-adversarial ways, and we need to be future-focused. It's not just a better mechanism to settle things after the blame has been dealt out. It's got to be about understanding what happened through the lens of figuring out, a la the Airbnb example, figuring out what matters about what happened for what happens next. So if that's why we do what we do, and the principles are how we show up, how we do what we do, then we can be able to talk to one another about what it is we do and what it is we need to do. And we can do that without competitiveness about, my practice is better than your practice. Really? You do it that way? We do it this way. We have a kit for you. I've left you a handout with exactly the structure about how you should do it. Our school program is better than your school training program. That is not us at our best. But it is us. And it's mostly us well-intended, actually, because we start from what we do, and we are so desperate to make sure that what we do is valued and what we do is understood and what we do can help, that we then find it hard to find a basis for a conversation with others who do things differently. We also find it hard to have conversations with others who say what they're doing is restorative, and we're deeply troubled and worried about that. Because we don't know where to start that conversation other than at the level of critiquing their practice, because it's not our practice, or finding other examples of better practice. We need to have those conversations. We need to have a lot of those conversations, because we'll never get better. But we need to start them by asking people, why are you doing that? Tell me more about why you do what you do and how you do it. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what you do. And if people can't and haven't had the opportunity to think more deeply about what they're doing because it came to them as instructions about what to do, and it seems to be working better than what they used to do, and they really want to do good things, so they've held on to this as an important life raft in the craziness of how we're structuring our human service systems, then the invitation to conversation is for us to be able to say, can we talk about then how you do that in different circumstances, how you would adapt and change and think about what you're doing and when what you're doing will work and won't work. And can we come at that with some understanding and articulation together that we're in this understanding and starting from the same place, starting from the same why. And if we're not, and if that's not where you've started from, and that's not what you understand about what you do, then that's the conversation we need to start. Because if we want to be greater than the sum of our practices, if we want restorative communities, if we want to live in restorative ways on this earth with one another, we got to be greater than the sum of our practices. It's not going to make the difference we seek. If we just do things differently, they might not make the difference we need. So we have to constantly be checking. We have to constantly be checking in a changing world with new problems and new issues. We have to be constantly checking in with one another about whether the different thing we're doing, the restorative thing we're doing, the practice we're using is working well, is working at all, works for some things and doesn't work for others. How can we make this way of working make the difference we seek? And I think the way we do that is we do that together. As for as much as we know about the importance of communities for structuring our own interpersonal lives and relationships, community, the intentionality with who we are with one another as a restorative community, how we're going to show up, how we're going to work together, how we're going to support one another, how we're going to understand one another, really matters. And that means that we need more than associations or networks or clubs or accreditation or the other ways in which we look to find others to help us. I think we need to use some of our restorative knowledge about principles, our restorative ways of working, and ensure that the way that we are building a worldwide community to support this work, to think differently, to call for a different way of being with one another, and then to support one another in our efforts to figure out how to do that and what to do about the problems that we face. How do we do that in a good way? I think we better be pretty attentive that we utilize our principles for how we work in building the ways in which we support one another. We learn together. We acquire knowledge together. We pick each other up. We cheer each other on. We know that it isn't actually about, oh, they beat us to it, or they're the first this, or they're better than us, or everybody look over there. I hope it's the case that we can all look over there, because if somebody's having some success, we should all ride on that as far as we can. And then when that's not working, we should pick up and run the next few yards and invite everybody to come with us. And we should all be cheering each other on, because the fact of the matter is there's enough work to go around. So I think that's why it's such an important opportunity for us to be together in this conference. It's such an important time to be connecting, thinking about our interpersonal relationships, the communities that we want to foster and that we live in, our environment, the world that we live in, the way that we are together as a community pursuing this way of being together, this vision of how the world could and should be. I think it's significant that we've come together in Vermont, in a place and a time and a space where our challenges are so obvious right now, and the possibilities of those who want to ask not just, are we doing the right things, or are we doing things right, but want to challenge the status quo to ask if we're doing the right things, is so clear, was so clear this morning as people welcomed us to this place and this space. And that others of us from other communities and from other places around the world that want to be with you in that work here in Vermont, but need you with us in the work we're doing, and that we would have an opportunity to learn together. That's really the hope of this idea of an international learning community. It's more a hope than it is a thing. Maybe one day it'll be fully a thing, and we'll be able to call each other, we'll be able to recognize each other as neighbors in this community, as the good neighbors who can show up like they all did at my grandmother's house and know that if we show up at each other's house, we will be fed, we will be nurtured, we will be taken care of, and then we'll be sent back out into the world to do good things, which was also the other thing my grandmother did. It came with high expectations. So I'm very excited to be at the front end of these 3 days. It's an incredible chance for us to all be together, and to be together working from the inside of that golden circle, from why we're here, to discover how we can do this together and better, to look at what we do. The panel that's going to come up after the break has come together to begin to show, to help us see the difference this way of thinking and this way of working has made for them, and has made for them as an invitation to the rest of our exploration of the difference it's making for all of us. So thanks very much.